Hello, everyone. We'd like to welcome you all to the webinar today. We're excited to launch the 4th edition of Universal Light. It's the biggest issue to date with 11 contributors. There are 6 distinct disciplines and contributors from 4 different countries. If you haven't received a copy of Universal Light, we will be sending a follow-up email.
And there'll be a link
where you can download it. Hold on 1 minute, I'm having a bit of an audio issue. Okay. We'd like to also give a mention to Unios, who publishes Universal Light. It's a biannual publication and for education and design resource for the lighting curious. We'd also like to acknowledge the support of women in lighting and women in design and construction, not only for their contributions to Universal Light, but to the value they provide in the industry. As many of you would be aware today, it is also the International Women in Engineering Day, which brings an increased awareness of the contributions of women in the world of engineering and construction. On the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A button. Please submit your questions as there's time allocated at the end for the panelists to respond to your questions. If your question is directed at a specific panelist, please include their name in the question so that we can throw to the right person. Let's start off by introducing the panelists. First of all, we have Wendy Davis. She's the Associate Professor in Lighting in the School of Architecture, Design and Planning at the University of Sydney. Since 2012, Wendy has led the Master's Program in Illuminating Design and Architectural Lighting Research Lab. I'll stop there and ask Wendy to give us a bit more about her experience and her current role.
Thanks, Marlene. I actually entered the field of lighting as a researcher after I finished my PhD in vision science. I worked for the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST. It's a non-regulatory agency in the US federal government for a number of years, and I really focused on the evaluation of LED color quality at that time. At the University of Sydney, I split my time between research, teaching, and a huge range of other activities like this. And my day-to-day activities really run the gamut from sort of high-level strategy, like setting the vision and curriculum for our professional master's program, to hands-on doing, like marking student work.
Thank you, Wendy. Now we'll move to Adriana Barr, who is a specialist lighting designer at WSP. Adriana has 6 years experience in the lighting industry and several awards to back that up. Adriana, can you tell us about where you started in the lighting industry and where you are today?
Yeah, sure thing. Hi, everyone. So I started working with a small boutique lighting supplier when I first graduated from uni. There I focused on lighting design for residential spaces, small hospitality and retail fit-outs. After doing that for a couple of years, I then moved on to work with an interior design firm, who are a really creative design firm called Collectivists, as their lighting designer. There I worked on an array of different projects, from large commercial office fit-outs to a lot of work in hospitality and retail. It was a really fast-paced working environment. I found that I learned a lot in a really short period of time, which was fantastic. And through that, I gained a lot of industry exposure just for the rate we were typically sending out projects. And then in late 2018, I was contacted by WSP, and I have now been working as part of their national lighting team for about a year and a half and really loving it.
Thank you, Adriana. Now we'll move on to Marnie Ogg, who is a dark sky defender and the CEO of ADSA. Marnie has officially been the CEO of the Dark Sky Alliance for 1.5 years, but her travel company that mixes tours with celestial science has been around for 14 years. Marnie, welcome. I'm sure that several of our attendees are wondering what a dark sky defender does and why your voice is extremely important in the world of lighting.
Thanks.
Over to you, Marnie.
It's a really lovely opportunity to be here and to be a part of this panel. So first of all, thank you for inviting me. And what does a dark sky defender do? Well, we try and bring a little bit of darkness to the world, I guess, by understanding the importance of dark and light in the environment. And to go back to the travel stuff that I've done, looking at that welcome slide is exactly what drove me to it. Seeing the joy of people in the dark, watching people experience things that they can't do in the light. And so for 15 years, I've been taking travelers around the world, understanding all sorts of wonderful places through a scientific set of views. But it was that drove me to realise how special the environment is in Australia, and that the darkness that we have in our country is actually worth preserving. So that's what we're doing now.
Thank you, Marnie. That was very informative. We have our final panelist, Cam, who's a relationship manager at Unios. She's been working in the lighting industry for over 14 years. She has applied her passion and education within various aspects of the lighting industry. Cam, can you take us briefly through your lighting journey?
Thanks, Marlene. Actually, some of you don't know, my journey began at design school. I wanted to become an interior designer. And at the time, I was working part-time in a retail store with fluorescent lamps and halogens. So this kind of sparked, no pun intended, sparked my interest, which led me to completing a master's coursework at Sydney Uni, actually headed by Professor Wendy on this panel. So thanks, Wendy. And where I kind of learnt the fundamentals and explored other disciplines of lighting, from the arts, the sciences and design. You know, fast track to today, a lot of those learnings apply in my current role, as Marlene said. So I'm just really thankful to be here with a panel of great women to share this with, and along the way has created quite a unique network of shared interests. So thanks for having me.
Thanks, Cam. Today we'll be discussing 4 topics that are top of mind in the industry. We'll look at diversity and inclusion, what the industry looks like post-COVID-19, the benefits of mentoring and networking, and what disruptions we think we should anticipate in lighting in the future. So let's kick it off. Most people would agree that diversity within an organization should reflect the community that they serve. Everyone needs lighting. It doesn't matter who you are, where you live, your upbringing, or your background. Let's start off with a quick poll. Would you consider your organization diverse and inclusive? And all the answers are confidential. I'll give you 10 seconds, yes or no. Wow, overwhelming results. We have 84% consider that their organizations are diverse and inclusive. That is a really good indication of how people are appreciating differences in perspectives. Sometimes diversity and inclusion are a bit confused in terms of what we're talking about. So we're going to throw to Adriana and ask her to define diversity and inclusion and highlight what the differences are between them. Adriana.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Marlene. I guess so the difference between diversity and inclusion, so diversity focuses on the makeup of your workforce. Obviously looking at a mixture of demographics, such as gender, race, ethnicity, age, sexual orientation, and work experiences, to name a few obvious ones. I think the important part of diversity inclusion is the inclusion part. I often feel like this is left out of the conversations. So inclusion is about ensuring everyone feels like they belong. And this allows for the diversity within a company to thrive. You can have a diverse company. However, if you're not proactively including everyone on an equal level, you are automatically missing out on the benefits of having a diverse workforce. So inclusion needs to take place across all levels of business. And also really importantly, I think it's an important part is the social aspect as well within a company. Studies show us that social aspects during at work can play a key role in creating and building inclusive cultures. So, you know, an example of this is a simple thing such as you organise a lunch with all like the guys from the office, but you leave out, you know, the two females or the new grad. That's not helping with building an inclusive culture in your company. So inclusion allows for everyone from different backgrounds to ensure that their voice is valued and everyone is included within company culture.
Thank you. Let's bring a bit of practicality to the table. And let's get your views, or actually your real life experiences. Adriana touched on it a bit. How we've witnessed diversity and inclusion being actually implemented. What's a really good real life example of how it worked within either an organization or wherever you've been? Who'd like to start?
I can talk to an example, Marlene, if you like. So just, I guess, a few from a sales perspective, I guess, working for companies who don't kind of slot you into that typical role of being an architectural rep. So moving up the ranks over time, it's very easy to put the female kind of persona in that design format of calling on architects and interior designers, but not thinking that you have the ability to speak to engineers. And that comes from that ingrained mindset that it's more male dominated in the engineering field. Calling on contractors and builders is very male focused. So breaking that and having an employer at the time that I had helping you through that and how to communicate to these particular audiences was part of a really good example for me of inclusion.
That is a very good example. We know that there's only 12% of women that work in the field of engineering and construction, but it's obviously important to have the voice out there. And once again, the ability to go in and speak with these people. Does anyone else have a good example of diversity and inclusion?
I'm not sure that I would quite consider this to be an example. I think that if there were, some really great examples, we could just implement them everywhere and then the problem would be solved. But touching on what you talked about, Marlene, in my own work, which of course is an academic institution and is quite a bit different than I think many of you guys work in, I have been able to witness the real power of representation. Having people that are diverse in roles of either leadership or power. An interesting example sort of from my own work is we have a lighting program, lighting master's program, and an acoustics master's program. And both of those fields are similarly technical, but the people that are running them, the academics like me, are different. I am a woman, I am foreign from Australia, and that's not necessarily the case with the folks that run the acoustics program. And when I look at the composition of students that are taking coursework, students that are working on PhDs, it sort of reflects the people that are in charge. And so I think a really powerful thing we need to do is to look at who we're representing at sort of the upper levels, because that there's a magnetism to that.
That's very interesting. So you're saying that the acoustics is run potentially by an Australian and doesn't attract as many foreign students?
I mean, there are a number of reasons as to why a program would attract international students, for instance. And the person who runs acoustics is fantastic. It's a great acoustics program. But, he is a white Australian man and ends up with a lot of men around him. He's a feminist. He wants women to join acoustics, but I think it becomes easier around me because people women can see themselves in me.
That's
I might just throw in there something too, Marlene, and that is, when you just said being from academia, it's different from, the rest of the panel, but it's also really different working in a charity that, we're trying to cut through, and our charity is about educating people about how to make good decisions around lights. So this is from a community level all the way up to council and decision makers. And so our board is made up of a real diverse cross-section of people. We've got equal males and females, we've got scientists, we've got academics, we've got lighting industry professionals, and that has really allowed us to cut through with our message so that it's not just one voice, one message. People know that speak, so they can use it in jargon and they can talk to that clientele or that market. And so I think particularly when it's a public service role, maybe it's very important to make sure that you've got lots of voices. Yeah.
That sounds good. Adriana, we'll ask you, you did speak briefly before about, giving the young people in the office a chance. Do you have any other examples in terms of positive impact of diversity?
Yeah, I was thinking about this the other day, and recently the Diversity Council launched a Words at Work initiative program, and it kind of once again focusing on the inclusion part of diversity and inclusion, and it sort of demonstrated how often our everyday language that we use without really thinking about it isn't necessarily inclusive, and without meaning to, we are actually excluding people just through the way we speak to one another. And what I found really interesting about that particular study is I'm discussing it with other individuals who had actually seen it. But like, it really made me realize that I wasn't even aware of how my language was being exclusive, or how what I was saying could in fact be upsetting to individuals. I think it really reflects back on the importance of educating ourselves about how we can be more inclusive, and what are our unconscious biases at the moment that often we're not even aware of.
That's a good self-reflection, and something I think that we should all think about in terms of the words we use demonstrates the thoughts that necessarily go on. Let's move on to COVID. No doubt it has stopped the world. There's no question that's impacted both us professionally and personally, and no one can predict the future. But believe it or not, we're in a position to influence it every day in our jobs. In recent years, we've been focusing on well-being in terms of space planning in the built environment. But after COVID, well-being has taken on a whole new meaning. Can we do another quick poll in terms of, do you think that your organization reacted swiftly and appropriately to COVID-19? Once again, yes or no? We will run this for another 20 seconds. Although it seems quite clear how people are feeling. All right. Once again, it's not the 80-20, we're 86% that people do feel that the organization that they're involved with has acted appropriately. And I do have to point out that we have attendees from every continent around the world. And from many different countries. And it's interesting that even though everyone has been affected in different ways, COVID has definitely influenced, and most organizations have done the right things by the people within them. But let's talk to our panelists about their thoughts on how COVID will impact in the world we work. So in terms of, what do you think are the mid to long-term effects of space planning and the built environment now that we've been exposed to COVID-19? Marnie, do you have any thoughts from a dark perspective?
Yeah, look, it's kind of interesting because we've just run a big Guinness World Records attempt to ask people to go out and look at the stars. And we kind of thought we might get a few thousand people. In the end, we got well over 10,000 people. And the comments that were made were about how they were astounded that they hadn't done this before, that they hadn't gone in their own backyard and looked up at the stars. Now, that's a bit of a segue to say that I think we do have a more enriched life for this period with COVID, having experienced not using our cars as much and actually looking for green urban spaces and actually going for walks around the block and seeing our natural environment. So I'm curious to see that if after COVID, we don't actually start not only creating more green spaces, but we could actually include some dark spaces in that as well, where people could actually go out of their apartment blocks and start seeing the stars from there. So that would be my challenge, yeah.
That sounds very, very comforting, very nice. I love a walk in the woods. Anyone else in terms of space planning in the built environment and how we think things will change? Cam?
Yeah, I think, we speak a lot to well-being and the social connection that our end users have in space planning and designing around that. I think now it's going to become more prevalent around the mental health foundations and how we start to think about the true impacts of that in a physical space. And now, with people working from home. The idea of working from home before was a challenge for some employers. And I think now when we look to what that actually looks like in terms of a virtual design space, this is something we start to think about. And I'm not saying that the home environment becomes, architecturally designed to a certain, way of a new office. But what I'm talking to is, we're talking about connecting people now through virtual means. What does that look like in terms of their footprint when they're actually in the office? That starts to kind of change.
Yes, that is interesting. Wendy, do you think that there'll be a change within academia in terms of how things will be taught?
That's a great question. First, I have to apologize. 2 minutes after this webinar started, my daylight situation got out of control, and I can't deal with it right now. So I'm sorry, everybody. I do think that universities have learned a lot of lessons, right? Things have been really hectic this year, and we've been flying by the seat of our pants, and some things have been really subpar, and we've just been getting by, but there have been some pleasant surprises. So I do think that we will see, particularly the more traditional universities like the University of Sydney. I don't think we're ever going to, an institution like ours will ever sort of get rid of face-to-face teaching. I think that is core to our approach. But I do think leveraging technology in a more consistent, more ambitious way is certainly the future. I think as though across the board, in or outside of academia, there's the possibility that we, in terms of the built environment, we'll really start to think about where we're sitting on the sort of the distributed versus the centralized continuum. And right now, particularly workplaces, it's a very sort of centralized model. But as Cam noted, if, say, working from home becomes more acceptable, this would be far more distributed. And I think that we could sort of have a mental exercise of thinking about how that would impact, say, lighting specifically. Are we lighting a space? That's what we do now. We light a space. Or are we lighting for a person? And those are very different approaches.
Yeah, I think I also want to just build on that as well from what Wendy was saying. I think it's really interesting. We're at a point, I guess, in like design technology and from a design perspective, where we have been looking at the implementation of smart buildings and integrating light and focusing on light reacting to the amount of people in a space and how we use a space. And I think since COVID-19, it's really sort of pushed up to the forefront of focusing, we don't need to have spaces fully illuminated anymore. We don't necessarily need a high level of light because, as Wendy was saying, there's only like 1 or 2 people in the space. So I think the whole lighting automation game is really going to play a key role in how we move forward with designing our commercial spaces in the future. So I think that's going to be really exciting and interesting to see how that develops and changes how we think about lighting our buildings in the future.
And I'm sure that that's something that is music to Marnie's ears, in fact, of reducing the amount of light that isn't being consumed and using light in a purposeful way. Yes?
Perfect.
Along with those green and dark spaces. All right, let's look on to another topic. So throughout our careers, either in the early stages or even in the wiser years, there are many professional benefits to mentoring and coaching. Although many of us are quick to self-criticize, we do need the support and the confidence to look at challenges from a different perspective. Likewise, networking increases, once again, the mental health, I guess, a sense of belonging and community support. Can we go to another quick poll? Are we ready, my poll man? Have you kept in touch with your first mentor throughout your career? Yes, no, or I've never had a mentor. We'll open that for 20 seconds. Pardon? All right, we'll end it there. That's interesting. There's a 50-50 split of those that have stayed in touch and those that have not. So I think perhaps within our careers, we change over time, and possibly that the mentor that we had when we started is not as applicable as where we are right now. Often we've changed careers and changed industries. So I would hope that people would pick up a new mentor in the area in which they're working. Over to the panelists in terms of your views on mentoring, and if you believe that the opportunities for training are the same for everyone. Cam?
Yeah, look, mentoring, I'll say, was a huge part of my progression and growth. Admittedly, some of the mistakes I made was thinking I could go from point A to Z and fast track my life to be at that end point. The mentors across both industry-wide and socially for me helped develop those incremental steps. So I think there's an essential need, and like you said, Marlene, you do grow out of particular mentors and find other ones, hopefully to become a mentor yourself one day. I think in regards to the opportunities for training around that, look, I think I can't speak from, I can speak from being in an educational environment, growing in my career, that the opportunities were always there, but not always fully embraced by people or encouraged by others around you. So there was a lot of self-ownership to taking those opportunities on from a learning perspective.
That's interesting. Adriana, can we hear from you on?
Yeah. I think what Cam's saying about taking ownership of your own learning and education, I think that's really key. I think it is up to the individual to take responsibility for, you know, what they want to learn and how they need to learn. I do think, though, it's not always equal in terms of the opportunities, training opportunities available. It also depends on, I guess, your geographic location. But obviously, if you're probably based in Sydney, there will be more training opportunities than, say, if you're based up in like Townsville in Queensland and trying to study lighting, which is quite a niche industry here in Queensland. But I think this is probably getting better. Like, I think as an industry, we are realizing the need to provide education and the need to provide more opportunities. I mean, as groups like, you know, WIDAC, Women Design and Construction, who are running more training sessions for women. I know the IES and Unios as well. I've been running more training sessions to try and expand those opportunities. So they're online now too. So you don't have to necessarily be in one location to have those opportunities. And I think that is in itself creating a more inclusive opportunity network for all involved.
Yes, I guess that is one of the questions, is in terms of how, you know, how accessible is it for everyone?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I was going to say, Marlene, if you'd asked me this question a year and a half ago, I could say I've never had a mentor. And that's partly because of the career choices I've made. And you know, I essentially I'm an entrepreneur. And so I recreate my world very frequently. But having now a mentor in the lighting world has just really strengthened my capacity to do things. I have to say, I wish I'd had one 30 years ago, you know, that, and to find a female, a woman who could talk to me in a way that, you know, really did shed a different light on aspects of my career or difficulties I was having. And so, yes, I would welcome opportunities to mentor other people as well, because I think there's a growth in actually being a mentor, and I don't think I've taken on that role. But it's important. It's really critical. Yeah.
It is. Wendy, I mean, you're in the position of seeing the students come through. Obviously, in the master's program, some have gone out and worked in the world and then decided to come back. How do you mentor your students ongoing, or do you attach them to other people?
I mean, I think we do a bit of both. There are certain aspects of their career and their education that I can mentor them on, and then there are others that I can't, right? I'm not a practitioner. But we set our program up such that the more practice-based units are taught by working professionals. And they are often incredibly generous with our students, which is, I think, super duper important. I wanted to touch on one other thing that I think has been interesting in this conversation is that, Marlene, your original question was about training. And the answers have sort of vacillated between training and education. I don't think those are entirely the same thing. And I think that not all of us want one versus the other. I do think what's kind of interesting about lighting is that unlike, say, architecture or civil engineering, there aren't these really strict educational standards, right? Like you wouldn't hire, hopefully, a civil engineer that just sort of like was self-taught. But you can absolutely do that with lighting. And there is a place in the industry for people with really sort of diverse backgrounds and knowledge bases. And I actually am not, even though I am a professional educator, I'm not opposed to that. If anything, I have kicked back against some accreditation attempts over time, because I don't think having everybody learn the exact same thing is actually going to move the industry forward. But I do think that, sort of tying into the bigger purpose of this webinar, that some is sort of inherent, or I get probably socially conditioned traits, make this a little bit trickier for people of different genders or people of different ethnic backgrounds to navigate. Because when there aren't these very clear, you know, you get this degree and then you can get this job, a lot of other things like your self-confidence will come into play as to whether you would even apply for a job. And there's plenty of research that shows that there are certain demographics of people who tend to be strong in self-confidence and others where we often need a bit more of a boost. And so I do wonder sometimes the extent to which the way education and lighting works has actually worked against women. I mean, there's quite a bit of evidence that shows if you show two identical job ads to men and women who are sort of equally qualified, there's a tendency where men will identify the criteria they meet and women will identify the criteria they don't meet. And that has a huge impact on sort of how we make decisions about our careers. So going back to Marnie's point, that's where a mentor, somebody with an outside eye that can look a little bit more objectively and push you when you need to be pushed, I think can be really valuable.
So you're saying that Donald Trump read the ad and thought he was qualified?
Ooh.
Anyway, in terms of mentoring and these networks and support, how do you broaden your networks, and how do you find the next generation of talent, and how do you connect with people that are not in your own backyard and like you? I know that Women in Lighting runs mentoring programs as well as Women in Design and Construction. But I guess from your personal levels, do you join organizations? How do you get out and connect a bit better? Adriana?
Yeah, I think personally, I found, I guess, through participating in those organizations you've just mentioned is like the first step. But then also, I guess, reaching out to me, I found like my older peers in the industry, not just those that I necessarily work with at WSP, but from all walks of the industry, and using them as a way to connect and learning from their experience as well. I also think to touch more on what I guess Wendy and Cam were saying too, with the confidence level as well, from a young person's perspective. I really find that we need to be empowering the young people of our industry who have the confidence to seek out for those mentoring opportunities and for those additional training opportunities as well. Like as Wendy said, we know statistically women are more likely to doubt themselves in certain areas. So I think we need to be more proactive with getting our leaders to like actively seek out and engage those individuals who are less likely to apply for something, and trying to provide that extra encouragement and support. I think that's going to help with, trying to make a change in our industry.
That's interesting. Marnie, I'm going to ask you a question. In terms of, you said previously you hadn't had a lighting mentor. How did you connect with somebody that had a different perspective than the one that you were coming from? How did that connection happen?
I have to say it's through conferences, actually. And that would be my response, is that conferences provide a really unique opportunity, depending how wide the conference topic is. But it was through that I met my mentor, and just, you know, whilst we have the same philosophy, she brings a different perspective. She has much more knowledge, and I would actually go a little bit further on from what Adriana was saying by saying that it would be, I think what was delightful about my mentor was that she actively looked at me and said, you know, I want to promote you. I want to help you. And so whilst it's great to have the courage and the skills or the confidence to actually go and seek out a mentor, we actually could look at the other way around and say, well, who are the women in lighting now that could actually spend a little bit of time to encourage people to foster that relationship, and to do it not, you know, just because they want to see the advancement of the organisation or the person.
That's very interesting. We should all reach out. Does anyone else have any thing that they'd like to share on that? Or shall we move on to the world of disruption? As we know, the world is constantly changing, and there are many standard practices that have changed. This is the final poll that we will leave open for 20 seconds. With respect to lighting, do you feel that we are embracing change or reacting to it? Are we being progressive and pushing boundaries and finding opportunities to disrupt? Or are we being conservative and being required to change and only reacting when we have to? And we'll leave it open for another 5 seconds. That's very interesting. At the beginning, we were very high on the conservative, and we still did finish ahead. That 60% believe that the integration of technology is where required, and not necessarily an innovation or a thought process of actually finding opportunities to disrupt. I'd like to get the panelists' view in terms of resistance. Do you think there's a resistance to the adoption of new technologies and new ways of conducting business?
I guess I will start. I don't think there's a conscious resistance. I don't think that lighting designers and suppliers are sitting in their offices being like, let's keep things exactly the way they are. I do think that the business model is really tricky, however. I remember, I am luckily been around long enough to remember before LEDs were commercialized for general illumination, but when there was excitement about it, when we, sort of the collective we, were talking about, you know, what these futuristic products would be able to do. And there were some really radical ideas that everybody was really jazzed about. And it's now like 15 years later, and we have more efficient light bulbs. And a big part of that is the business model, right? To go from a commodity item that an incandescent lamp was, all incandescent lamps were basically exactly the same, to differentiated products requires a fair bit of risk, right? To create something and hope that a consumer or a building owner will pay more for this special awesome thing this new luminaire will do is risky. And as we sort of watch the adoption of LEDs, the manufacturers weren't taking that risk. And again, I can't blame them. They needed to feed themselves, presumably. But that's sort of how we ended up with, again, more efficient light bulbs.
That is a very interesting perspective. Thank you, Wendy. Anyone else in terms of the view with regards to resistance in change?
I think from a, I guess, looking at from a purely a lighting design perspective and how we complete and present lighting design concepts and documentation for our clients, I think, I don't know if it's a resistance or more of lack of awareness of what current software programs and technologies can be used to enhance our designs and how we present them to clients. I think the lack of update on that has been frustrating as a young person, as we're kind of limiting, I guess, what we can do as lighting designers, and also showing the world what we do and why it's important. I mean, I feel like a lot of the time I spend convincing clients that they need to have a lighting designer on board, or the importance of the role we actually play. And there's a lot of technology and digital software programs out there at the moment that allow us to demonstrate the reasons why we should be involved quite clearly. And I've just been surprised coming into the industry how not necessarily all of your major firms are quick on these updates to these programs, or not even sure how to fully use them. So I think I don't know if that's resistance or just lack of awareness, but I think it's just a matter of education and educating everyone involved in these processes, why we should be looking at, these new innovative technologies to enhance what we do and make it better.
That's very interesting. Cam, can you give us a view from a manufacturer's or supplier's perspective? Obviously, you talk to a variety of people, and what's your view?
Yeah, I think coming from that manufacturer product selling kind of mindset, this is where you have to kind of think outside the box about, Wendy mentioned you've just created another more efficient light source. This is where we start to consider things like automation and control, and the consultative salesperson is developed, coming out to look and explore, well, it's not just about developing that product, it's a downlight, right? It's nothing extremely exciting about that, but how do we now implement other aspects of design principles? And this is where I think manufacturers lose, that they're not conversing with the designers, with users of the space, with other aspects that might influence why their product might actually not be suitable. I mean, more often than not, the quadrant four downlights in a space is a thing of the past, and we're still putting that into our mechanisms of selling and design. So this is where I think we really have to push for consultative mindsets around a solution and not focusing on the product. It's new, it's innovative, but are you really creating something new?
Very interesting. Marnie, in terms of, I guess, dark skies, and this is the way that we've always done it, but obviously a long time ago there weren't light bulbs. What's your view in terms of resistance to change?
Yeah, look, I think COVID's a really good example. We all of a sudden had to turn our lives around because there was an impetus to change. And I think that's part of the thing now, is that we're actually not questioning the standards. We have these lighting standards that tell us we have to have certain, kilowatts of light on streets, etc., and we have to use it this way. And yet there are governments around the world that are challenging those standards and are implementing things, and the world isn't crumbling, and people are still getting around their duties and their daily tasks. So I think there's probably a little bit of reluctance to change, and I think there's lack of education about other products and other ways of doing things. But my belief is that we're a bit lazy. We kind of just go with the everyday thing because that's what's always happened. And sometimes I think it takes someone maybe like me to throw a little bit of a hand grenade into the situation and say, well, have you thought about this? Have you, is there a better way? And I know that some of the work that I've been involved with the Department of Agriculture and Water and Environment, we're even asking the questions, can we invent a new light source that doesn't harm our wildlife? Not what have we got that we can put in there, but can we actually create something new? And we're just talking about it, but to actually take that challenge on would be, exciting and new. And, what can we create? What is the new world of lighting like? What can we do with it?
That is a very interesting perspective. I guess in terms of disruption, what are the other disruptions that we think are potentially out there? We talk of COVID, we talk about technology and implementing technology within the light bulb. What other crazy ideas are out there that, we think are a bit left of field but might actually enhance the world in which we live? Anyone?
Well, I think there comes a time, and I think there already is coming a time where we're no longer talking about the light bulb. It's not about the particular light source. Light becomes integrated within our spaces. You know, with LED technology, every year we see light sources are becoming smaller and smaller and smaller. You know, it's no longer, you know, your bulb in the ceiling. You know, lighting has been integrated in furniture, into walls, into fabric, into carpet. And I guess, you know, for me, it's a really exciting time to sort of see where lighting design and how we light spaces is going. I think there'll be some point where we're no longer talking about a single like light point source. We're talking about how we generally use light as a tool to illuminate spaces. And I think that's going to be a really interesting time in the next couple of years as we see that sort of transition.
That's interesting. And Wendy, I'm going to ask you a question, because in your article in Universal Light, obviously you're involved with a lot of thesis, a lot of creative thinking. How do you think that new technologies can be embraced and the risks of them?
I mean, I think as far as how new technologies can be embraced, I think that we need to have sort of research into how we want to light a space. This goes back to a little bit what Adriana was speaking about, sort of the use of the light. If we look at sort of modern lighting design practices, most of them evolved out of the limitations of older technologies, right? You had an incandescent lamp or fluorescent tube, and there's really only so many things you can do with it. So we've sort of set that up. Whereas now we actually, especially with the small size and the spatial control and all these cool things, we could say, okay, the technology isn't limiting us. Let's think about where we want the light, when we want the light, what characteristics of the light do we want there? And then say, okay, well, we would need to do some investigation to figure out what would be optimal. So in some ways, I think we kind of need to back up to the beginning and pretend that we don't really know how lighting works and figure out, how do we want lighting to work? I think that that's a big part. And I'll actually say my article, I haven't had a chance to read the issue yet. I think might have a touch in common with Marnie's, because I also am of the opinion that strict adherence to standards, the sort of sanctification of standards, can be a real problem. So I think that getting away from being so dependent on it, I think they have a place and a purpose, and I'm not like anti-standard, but I think sort of we've been conflating meeting standards with like, I've done design. And those are not the same.
Yeah, sounds good. All right.
Something in there. I think something else that might be an interesting way of looking at lighting, and it sort of runs off what Wendy was saying, is our cultural awareness of lighting as well, and our relation to it from a cultural perspective. So, are we just adopting lights because they're being manufactured in China? That, you know. And something I read is that more the Chinese and Asian markets have more blue-white lights, and so are we adopting that because that's what is available to us and using that, and that's just becoming the norm? And are we losing our own cultural identity in taking that? And that became very apparent to me when I went to Norway in winter during polar nights, and I did not see one light anywhere that wasn't warm amber, and the environment was, and so I could see it was a cultural ritual that this is the kind of lighting that they use, and it felt warm and inviting and lovely. So yeah, I just think maybe there's a bit of a cultural relationship that we could actually tap into and create our own unique identity around it as well.
Yes, and I think it can I throw out a cam briefly, just to talk about the fact that there is opportunity now for different lights.
Yeah, I think, just feeding off what everyone's kind of saying, I think the cultural identity layer is a really important thing. The disconnect there is trying to fulfill the whole concept of standards, and products have fed into that for years. And this is a huge part of the issue, and trying to turn that slow moving ship is just, you know, incredibly long and arduous. If there was a layering of guidelines culturally stemmed or specifically to the Australian market, for example, or those countries that each of you witnessing us today represent, that's something we could start to employ. I mean, the standards are there as recommendations and not necessarily the best outcome. In terms of how we think about product, you know, we think about the light switch, for example. I mean, I was trying to present the other day to residential clients that, you know, the concept of Bluetooth technology working off their phone, but the thought of losing control for these clients, not being able to flick a light switch, was devastating for them. So this is a kind of weird time where people are wanting automation and technology is coming in with this disruption around you don't have to think about things. But the thought of losing control, a simple mechanism of flicking a light switch, is hard to fathom for some. So there is a mindset shift we have to go through. And how do we keep that control within the user of the space, but embrace technology at the same time? That's kind of where, you know, I don't have an answer for that, but that's kind of where I'm thinking.
Great. I think we're going to end it there and try to get some questions in before the end of our webinar. So we are going to do one from Cherie McNair. Apologies if I haven't said your name correctly. I'd be interested to hear people's experiences or suggestions on encouraging a better representation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and people with disabilities. What are some of the barriers of working in lighting for these groups?
Yeah, that's obviously I might start. That's a great question. Personally, at WSP, we do a lot of work with trying to, I guess, make sure that we are representing and talking about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures. So one of the initiatives that we actually have with a lot of our major design projects too, we try to incorporate some sort of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultural elements within the design itself. So for example, our latest office that we have just completed, we actually had Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander representatives come in, and they actually assisted us with certain layouts of spaces, and also we also integrated a lot of Aboriginal artwork in the space. Although I think again with some of that might seem just a bit broken, I think it's important as we are trying to encourage the conversation and making sure that these people are so important in our cultural heritage that we do make sure they are included in our mainstream conversations and within our, you know, large public spaces as well.
Interesting. Does someone else have a perspective in terms of inclusion of our, well, the Australian Aboriginal and Torres Straits?
I think it's a recap of what we just discussed. Sorry, Marlene, just what Marnie on with cultural identity. And this is something we'd really need to explore in terms of both our, you know, Indigenous communities and the cultural mindset of Australia across the board. For example, if we're speaking to Australia, being such a multicultural environment and stemming from the root cultures that, you know, we identify ourselves with, I think it's something we'll have to build going forward, stepping away from the traditional standards, as we've mentioned earlier.
Okay, let's go on to another question. This one is from an anonymous attendee. So to Wendy and Adriana made a very valid point that there are limitations to where, in fact, you can learn lighting in terms of coursework. Being in academia and in learning from COVID, do you think courses can be taught digitally rather than being restricted to the state itself? Or are you on the side that you only need to learn in person?
I might go first this because this is sort of a personal experience for me. So when I started, I wanted to study lighting at an academic level. There wasn't any courses in Queensland to study lighting at an academic level at the time. I mean, obviously we know that the University of Sydney runs a Masters in Illuminations and Lighting courses, but they are only face-to-face courses. So for me, it was actually really frustrating for the first, I think, maybe 2 years of my lighting career. I really wanted to learn more, but there was no online courses. Luckily for me, the IES Society did restart the lighting course in Queensland, which I have now completed. but I do think there is a huge gap that we don't have online opportunities in Australia to learn about lighting and further lighting education. I think that's a huge gap currently in our industry. I'd love to hear Wendy's perspective on this too.
So I'll say straight off the bat, I personally prefer face-to-face teaching. I find it more gratifying, and I find that most of my students prefer face-to-face teaching after the little experiment we had this semester. That said, I actually don't believe that lighting can only be taught face-to-face. I think it absolutely could be taught online. I think certain parts of lighting education become a fair bit more challenging, the more design, sort of practice-based ones, but doable, absolutely doable. I do think that in lighting, we have a complicated relationship with education. Everybody says they want it. Everybody says they value it. And the number one criticism I get from even our local professional associations is that it's too expensive. And it is expensive. Don't get me wrong. It is expensive. But I feel like as an industry, we're constantly trying to convince the world quality lighting products are expensive. Quality lighting design is going to cost you money. And so yes, quality lighting education is going to cost money. And so I think that the relatively few offerings, which I totally agree, and I think that that's a real challenge for people that don't happen to live in, you know, Sydney or Pennsylvania, right? There's like a handful of places. Also has to do with sort of like market forces. I think that if people were willing to sort of pay what unfortunately it ultimately costs, and we can argue about the management of higher education, but we'll park that, that there probably would be more online offerings. It's something I have had an interest in, particularly with regard to like photometry and colorimetry. I think that those are skills that can be taught online, and that lighting designers in general are pretty weak with. But, you know, in order to make that investment, because teaching online, actually, the prep is a lot more than teaching face-to-face. I can rock up and give a lecture and it's pretty easy. But teaching online requires a lot more time. And so it's in some ways about critical mass and us being a small field. So that's not a very satisfying answer, but I do believe that you can learn lighting online.
It's just going to cost you more.
Well, no, it's going to cost you the same. But like I said, it's not cheap.
Yeah. Education is expensive, but if it's valued and it brings an increase of knowledge, obviously it's very worth it. We'll go to one more question. Combining the topic, and this one is from Francesca Bassatani. Combining the topic of diversity and mentorship and access, do the panelists feel that the field of lighting is one that is open and accessible to people from different socioeconomic backgrounds? Is there a barrier to entry? And if so, how do we improve this? So really looking at the socioeconomic backgrounds of people, and does that hold them back from working in lighting?
I'd like to start off with this one. I mean, I think in general across life, socioeconomic background does hold people back. Like, there's no denying that, you know, people that are born into privilege have an easier time. I think relative to other fields, it's something I mentioned earlier about the fact that we don't have very regimented, sort of accredited educational requirements, does open things up a bit more. There are a number of lighting professionals that came in through the trades, right? That originally were trained as electricians, worked as electricians, got an interest in lighting. Some of them come on and do master's degrees. And so in that regard, I do think that we're actually on the accessible side of a profession, because there are roles regardless of sort of your educational background. But I'm looking at it in some ways from an outsider perspective. So I'd love to hear from people like Kim and Adriana about that.
Yeah, well, I just might add, I do think lighting is an accessible industry. Also following on from Wendy's comments, like there's so many avenues into this industry. Like most people you meet didn't wake up one day and decide, I'm going to be a lighting designer. Most people don't know what that is. They sort of fall into the industry through, they worked in sales, or they were an interior designer who then established a love for lighting, or they were an electrician, or they were a builder. or they were just interested in light and somehow managed to fall into the open doors of lighting. So I do think it is very accessible. As Wendy said, it's not a direct career path. It's not like civil engineering where, you know, you go to uni, you get the degree, you come out, you're a civil engineer. There's so many different backgrounds. Theatre is another one. People in the Parliament who just have fallen into the industry by chance. I think most people I've met, you know, they've come in such avenues that really, I think, for me, demonstrates that, you know, you can come from anywhere and come into lighting.
Interesting. And Cam?
Yeah, I agree with a lot of everything that Adriana said. I think the disconnect comes in definitely across the board, is after the fact, after the education process is, I don't know if it's changed now, but what I found was the lack of ability to just approach certain disciples, whether it be in sales or design or engineering. There was a great disconnect with being able to approach some of the people that might help you break into the industry post-education. So that's kind of where I saw a little bit of that disconnect or disadvantage, regardless of socioeconomic background, to be honest.
Okay. Well, unfortunately, that's where we're going to have to wrap up, guys. I want to thank you all for your honest and thoughtful discussions today. We all agree that it's an interesting time and the world is an unprecedented place. The best that we can do is start the change. Obviously, discussions like this add value to understanding there's many different perspectives, and also for people to reach out and learn a bit more. We don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. COVID-19's taken over Victoria again, but hopefully the rest of us are safe and well, and look forward to seeing you on our next webinar. Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all.
See ya.
Bye.